December 17, 1941. Washington, D.C. Admiral Chester William Nimitz sat in the office of the Chief of Naval Operations and received the assignment that he had not sought, that he knew would be the hardest command in the history of the United States Navy, and that he accepted with the specific quiet competence that defined everything about the man who accepted it. He was being given command of the Pacific Fleet. The Pacific Fleet that Nimitz was being given command of was not the fleet that had existed on December 6, 1941. That fleet had been the largest and most powerful naval force the United States had ever assembled, the instrument through which American power projected itself across the Pacific and which had been, for a decade, the central deterrent to Japanese expansion in the region. On the morning of December 7th, that fleet had been attacked at Pearl Harbor while its capital ships were at anchor, and in 90 minutes of aerial assault the Japanese had sunk or disabled 8 battleships, damaged 3 cruisers, sunk 4 destroyers, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The Pacific Fleet that Nimitz was being given command of was a fleet without its battleships, in a war against a Japanese Navy that had demonstrated at Pearl Harbor a capability for carrier-based aviation that exceeded anything American naval planners had specifically prepared for. Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, and immediately began the assessment that the command required. He had been a submariner and a surface officer and had studied naval strategy his entire career, and what he saw at Pearl Harbor was both the damage that the attack had done and the specific things the attack had not done. The fleet's dry docks had not been destroyed. Most of the sunken battleships were in shallow water and would eventually be raised and repaired. The fuel storage facilities, containing millions of gallons of fuel oil that the Pacific Fleet's operations depended on, were intact, and the fleet's aircraft carriers, which had been at sea during the attack, were undamaged. Nimitz was a man of specific and disciplined analysis, and his analysis of Pearl Harbor's aftermath focused on what he had rather than what he had lost. What he had was 3 fleet carriers, a submarine force that was intact, and the infrastructure of Pearl Harbor itself. What he had was the intelligence capability that Commander Rochefort's codebreakers were developing, which would eventually give him the ability to read Japanese naval communications with sufficient accuracy to direct his forces against Japanese vulnerabilities rather than Japanese strengths. The first major test of Nimitz's command came in May and June of 1942, the months of the Coral Sea and Midway, and the decisions he made in those months were the decisions that determined the outcome of the Pacific War. At Coral Sea, Nimitz sent 2 carrier task forces into the South Pacific to intercept a Japanese invasion force aimed at Port Moresby, accepting the tactical risk that the engagement required and achieving the strategic result that stopping the invasion provided. The Coral Sea was a tactical draw and in narrow tonnage terms a Japanese tactical victory, but it stopped the Port Moresby invasion and forced the Shokaku out of action for months. At Midway, Nimitz made the decision that defined his command. His codebreakers had told him that the Japanese were going to attack Midway Island in early June. He could not be certain the intelligence was correct. He could not afford to be wrong. If the intelligence was correct and he positioned his carriers to intercept the Japanese attack, he had a chance to destroy Japanese carrier aviation at its most experienced and capable. If the intelligence was wrong and the Japanese attacked elsewhere, he had left the Pacific Fleet's most valuable assets exposed to destruction. He trusted the codebreakers. He positioned 3 carriers northeast of Midway to intercept a Japanese carrier force of 4. His forces were outnumbered and outweighed. He gave his commanders the objective and the authority to achieve it, and then he stepped back from the specific operational decisions that he trusted his commanders to make better than he could from Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers and the experienced aircrews that had been the core of Japanese carrier aviation. It was the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War, and it happened because Nimitz had trusted intelligence and positioned his forces to intercept a Japanese force that the Japanese believed would never be found where it was found. The 2 years that followed Midway were the years of the Pacific Campaign's steady and grinding advance across the island chains and the ocean distances that separated Pearl Harbor from Tokyo, and Nimitz commanded that advance with the specific qualities that Pearl Harbor had given him the opportunity to demonstrate. He was not theatrical. He did not make speeches that became famous or strike poses for photographers, or seek the dramatic gestures that his peer MacArthur made into a professional methodology. He worked. He analyzed. He listened to his subordinate commanders and gave them the authority to execute the operational plans they developed within the strategic framework he maintained. He fired commanders who did not perform and replaced them with commanders who did, not with the dramatic confrontations that Eisenhower and Patton and MacArthur and their various subordinates and peers produced, but with the quiet professionalism of a man who understood that command was about results and that the personal elements were secondary to the professional ones. His relationship with Admiral Halsey, who commanded the South Pacific and later the Third Fleet, illustrated his command philosophy. Halsey was aggressive, theatrical, profane, and effective, and Nimitz used him precisely where his specific qualities produced the results that the operational situation required while managing the specific risks that those qualities also produced. When Halsey's aggressive pursuit of a Japanese carrier decoy left Leyte Gulf unprotected during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Nimitz sent the famous message that became one of the most debated communications of the Pacific War. "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." The last three words were a padding phrase that had been added by a communications officer, and that was supposed to be stripped before transmission. They were not stripped. They reached Halsey with the sting of a question that implied judgment, and Halsey, who was deeply upset by the implication, turned his force back toward Leyte Gulf in an action that came too late to prevent the crisis and too early to complete the destruction of the Japanese carrier force he had been pursuing. The communication reflected the limits of command at the distances of the Pacific War, the impossibility of a commander in Pearl Harbor managing the specific operational decisions of a fleet commander in the Philippine Sea, and the specific awkwardness of a communication that had been imprecise in its tone and accidentally devastating in its effect. Nimitz handled the aftermath with the same quiet professionalism that characterized everything about him, acknowledging his own role in the communication's awkwardness and supporting Halsey in the subsequent criticism without abandoning his own assessment of what had happened. The relationship between Nimitz and MacArthur, who commanded adjacent theaters and who had fundamentally different personalities and fundamentally different views about how the Pacific War should be conducted, was one of the most important and most carefully managed command relationships of the war. MacArthur believed the war should be won through the Philippines, which he had promised to return to and which he considered both his personal obligation and the correct strategic axis. Nimitz believed the Central Pacific Campaign, the drive through the island chains toward Japan, was the strategically decisive axis. The Joint Chiefs, faced with two theater commanders who each had compelling strategic arguments and neither of whom could be dismissed, eventually authorized both campaigns simultaneously, a decision that divided American resources but that also prevented the Japanese from concentrating their defenses against a single axis of advance. Nimitz managed his relationship with MacArthur with the specific diplomatic skill that the situation required, and that was entirely contrary to MacArthur's theatrical approach to everything. He did not argue publicly with MacArthur's strategic vision. He did not compete with MacArthur for press attention or for political support. He built the naval force that the Central Pacific Campaign required, and he advanced it toward Japan while MacArthur advanced through the Philippines. Both campaigns contributed to Japan's defeat. Neither campaign would have been as effective without the other. The specific outcome, Japan's defeat in the Pacific in 3.5 years, was the product of both axes of advance and of the naval power that Nimitz's command had rebuilt from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to become the most powerful fleet ever assembled in the Pacific. By the summer of 1945, the fleet that Nimitz commanded in the Pacific had grown from the damaged remnant of December 1941 to an armada of 6,768 ships, including 28 fleet and light carriers, 23 battleships, 72 cruisers, 232 destroyers, and 232 submarines. The most powerful naval force in history, built in 3.5 years from a fleet that had been crippled at its moorings. On September 2, 1945, Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay alongside MacArthur and signed the instrument of Japan's surrender as the representative of the United States. The two men who had commanded America's Pacific War from the ashes of Pearl Harbor stood together at the moment that the war had been building toward since that December morning when everything had changed. Nimitz signed his name. MacArthur spoke. Each contributed what he had contributed throughout the war. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz received the thanks of a nation that, because he had been so consistently untheatrical about his accomplishments, sometimes needed to be reminded of the specific things those accomplishments had been. He had taken command of a devastated fleet on December 17, 1941, 10 days after the worst defeat in American naval history. He had rebuilt that fleet while simultaneously fighting the war he was rebuilding it for. He had trusted his codebreakers at Midway when trusting them was a calculated gamble of extraordinary magnitude. He had managed two theater commanders, one of whom was Douglas MacArthur, without losing either the strategic focus or the working relationships that the command required. He had won. He had won by doing what the architects of large victories always do, by seeing the strategic situation clearly, by making decisions at the right level of command rather than micromanaging the operational and tactical details that his subordinate commanders handled better than he could, by trusting the right people and replacing the wrong ones without drama, by keeping his eye on the objective through 3.5 years and 10,000 miles of Pacific warfare. Old soldiers never die, MacArthur had said. Chester Nimitz died in February 1966, at the age of 80, at his home on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay, which he had chosen because he could see the Pacific from his window. He had never entirely left it. The fleet he had built and the war he had won were out there somewhere beyond the horizon, in the specific way that the things men do that matter most remain present for them even when they are no longer doing them. Nimitz had won the Pacific War. He had done it without making it look like winning, which is perhaps the most sophisticated form of victory available to a great commander. The fleet he had built to do it was out there beyond the horizon of San Francisco Bay. He could see it from his window,